This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is another installment of The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. This is Chapter 19, a chapter of disclosures, 1853 to 1854. Now come an appalling series of disclosures regarding public officials. Acting on the affidavit of James E. Coulter, a lobbyist, charging that there was a private organization in the Board of Aldermen formed to receive and distribute bribes, the grand jury, after investigation, handed down a presentment on February 26, 1853, together with a vast mass of testimony. Stated the presentment, quote, "It was clearly shown that enormous sums of money have been expended for and towards the procurement of railroad grants in the city, and that towards the decision and procurement of the 8th Avenue Railroad grant, a sum so large that would startle the most credulous was expended. But in consequence of the voluntary absence of important witnesses, the grand jury was left without direct testimony of the particular recipients of the different amounts." Unquote. Solomon Kipp, one of the grantees of the 8th and 9th Avenue Railroad franchises, admitted frequently to a member of the grand jury that he had expended, in 1851, upwards of $50,000 in getting them. 5 grantees of the 3rd Avenue Railroad franchise swore that upwards of $30,000 was paid for it in 1852 in bribes to both boards. Of this sum, Alderman Tweed received $3,000. Chief among those who bribed the aldermen were Elijah F. Purdy, one of the line of grand sachems, and Mindert Van Schaik, who only a few years before had been the Tammany candidate for mayor. A franchise for a surface railroad on Broadway, with scarcely any provision for compensation, and with permission to charge a 5-cent fare, was given to Jacob Sharp over 5 profitable bids from responsible persons. One applicant, Thomas E. Davies, had offered to give the city 1 cent for every fare charged. In another application, Davies, D.H. Haight, and others had offered $100,000 a year and the payment of a license fee of $1,000 on each car, the prevailing fee being $20, for a 10-year grant, on the agreement to charge a 5-cent fare. There were 2 other offers equally favorable. When Mayor Kingsland had vetoed the bill, the aldermen had repassed it, notwithstanding an injunction forbidding them to do so. Dr. William Cockcroft had to pay, among other sums, $500 to Assistant Alderman Wesley Smith to get favorable action on his application for a lease of the Catherine Street Ferry. After the passage of the grant, Smith demanded $3,000 more, which Cockcroft refused to pay. Bertus Skidmore, a coal dealer, testified that in the fall of 1851, James B. Taylor informed him that he had been an applicant for a ferry across the East River to Greenpoint, and that, quote, he bribed members of the Common Council for the purpose of obtaining said grant, and that other applicants for the same ferry gave a larger bribe than he did, and obtained the grant, and that all members of the Common Council whom he had bribed returned to him the money he had paid them, with the exception of Alderman Wood, who kept the money from both parties." Unquote. John Morrill swore that one of the applicants for the lease of the ferry to Williamsburg applied to some of the aldermen and was told that it would cost about $5,000, quote, "to get the grant through," unquote. But a Mr. Hicks, another applicant, was so eager to get it through that he gave more than $20,000. The lease of the Wall Street ferry was similarly disposed of. Silas Herring testified that he, with others, was told he could secure it by paying a certain alderman $5,000. Herring declined. James Taylor was another applicant in 1852. He was informed that it would cost him $15,000. He offered $10,000, but on the same night, Jake Sharp offered $20,000 and got the grant. Taylor also testified that he additionally applied for the Grand Street ferry lease. Other parties, however, paid more bribe money and obtained it, whereas one alderman said that, quote, "it was the damnedest fight that was ever had in the Common Council. It cost Taylor's rivals from $20,000 to $25,000, unquote. The aldermen extorted money in every possible way. In defiance of the mayor's veto, they gave a $600,000 contract for the quote-unquote Russ street pavement, afterward found to be worthless, and which had to be replaced at additional cost. Russ had offered one assistant alderman $1,000 to help carry his election the next fall if he voted favorably. Exorbitant prices were paid for land on Ward's Island, several aldermen and officials receiving for their influence and votes bribes of $10,000, and others even larger sums. The Common Council sold to Reuben Lovejoy the Gansevoort market property for $160,000, in the face of other bids of $225,000 and $300,000. Interesting. Gansevoort. Those were the ancestors of Herman Melville. Although by the time Melville came around, the family had lost their riches and had to work for a living. Continuing. Lovejoy, who, it was disclosed, was merely a dummy for James Taylor and others, testified, quote, that it would cost from $40,000 to $75,000 to get this operation, the purchase of the Gansevoort property, through the city government, unquote. A coal merchant had to pay money for a favorable vote on his application for a lease of the Jefferson Market property, and another merchant testified to having paid one assistant alderman about $1,700 to get a pier lease. The aldermen demanded and received bribes not only for passing measures, but for suppressing them, and even invented many quote-unquote strikes, as instanced by the case of Alderman Smith, who agreed for $250 to silence a resolution to reduce the coroner's fees. They demanded a share of every contract made by any city official, threatening, if it were not given, to stop his supplies and have his accounts investigated. If a contractor or lessee refused to meet a quote-unquote request, the alderman retaliated by imposing burdens upon him and reporting hostile resolutions. Applicants for the police force paid the police captains $40, and more to the aldermen who appointed them. One man was reappointed police captain by Alderman Thomas J. Barr for $200, and another assistant captain for $100. Every city department was corrupt. It was found that 163 conveyances were deeded to the chief of police, George W. Matsell, and his partner, Captain Norris, in about a year. Matsell was mentioned also as receiving money from about 100 men who patronized the odious Madame Restell's establishment in a Greenwich street. Both the police and aldermen collected money from saloons, though the aldermen obtained the larger share, as they had the power of granting licenses. Within 3 or 4 years, William B. Reynolds received over $200,000 from the city under a 5-year contract for removing dead animals, offal, and bones, though at the time the contract was made, other persons had offered to remove them free of expense. And one had even offered to pay the city $50,000 a year for the exclusive privilege. There's your tax money hard at work, huh? That's America. That's real American history. It was owing to Controller Flagg's action that a contract to index certain city records at a cost of between $200,000 and $300,000, despite the offer of a well-known publisher to do it for $59,000, was canceled. Flimsy tenement houses, causing later much fatality and disaster, were built in haste, there being no supervisory authority over their erection. The lighting of the city was insufficient, thousands of oil lamps still being used, and these, according to an old custom, not being lighted on moonlit nights. Both Tammany and Whig aldermen and officials were implicated in these disclosures. Such was the system of city government that, though 29 aldermen were at one time under judgment of contempt of court, and a part of the same number under indictment for bribery, yet under the law they continued acting as judges in the criminal courts. Oh, that's beautiful. According to Judge Vanderpoel, bribery was considered a joke. A new reform movement sprang up, which quickly developed into the City Reform Party. The reformers proposed, as a first step, to amend the charter. The granting of leases for more than 10 years was to be prohibited, and the highest bidder was to get them. A 2/3 vote was to be required to pass a bill over the mayor's veto. Work to be done, and supplies furnished costing more than $250, were to be arranged for on contract to the lowest bidder. Any person guilty of bribery, directly or indirectly, was to be sentenced, upon conviction, to not above 10 years in prison, and fined not over $5,000, or both. The right to sit as judges of the criminal courts was to be taken away from the aldermen, as was also the power of appointing policemen. The board of assistant aldermen was to be abolished, and a board of councilmen, consisting of 60 members, was to be instituted in its place. The collective title of the two boards to be, quote-unquote, the Common Council. The aldermen were to be elected for 2 years, as determined in the Charter of 1849, and the councilmen for 1 year, An efficient auditing of accounts and claims against the city was called for, and only the more popular branch of the Common Council was to originate appropriations of money. Tammany had grown suddenly virtuous again, and responding to the public clamor over the disclosures, had declared its devotion to pure government. At a quote-unquote reform meeting of the Young Men's Union Club, John Cochran, one of Wood's lieutenants, who later announced that he would vote, quote, "for the devil incarnate if nominated by Tammany Hall," unquote, declared, quote, "Reform is at home in Tammany Hall. Its birthplace is Tammany Hall," unquote. What a bullshitting politician, huh? Well, there's no shortage of them. All down through history. The purification movement advanced so unmistakably that Tammany approved the amendments, and the legislative bill embodying some of them was supported by the Tammany delegation in the Senate and Assembly. The bill passed, and upon being submitted to the people of the city in June 1858, was adopted by the significant vote of 36,000 to 3,000. One of the benefits due to the City Reform Party was the reorganization, in 1853, of the police under a separate department. The police were compelled to wear a uniform against which there had been bitter prejudice, and the term of appointment was made dependent upon good behavior. Fortunately for the City Reform Party, the division between the hard shells and soft shells, extending throughout the state, caused the nomination of separate Democratic tickets in the fall of 1853. There seemed less than ever any vital difference between the professed principles of the two. Under the name of quote-unquote National Democrats, the Hardshells met in City Hall Park on September 26th and resolved, quote, "We regret that the democracy of the city are prevented from holding this meeting in their accustomed hall. The democracy of the city waged in time past a successful war against a corruption which sought to control by money the political destinies of the country. We now, from this time forward, commence a campaign against another corporation known as the Tammany Society, a secret, self-elected, and irresponsible body of men who have dared to usurp the right of determining who shall and who shall not meet in Tammany Hall. The accidental ownership of a small equity of redemption of a small part of the ground upon which Tammany Hall stands may continue to enable the sachems to prevent the democracy from meeting within the hall, but we can meet in the park or in the open air or elsewhere," unquote. The City Reform Party nominated acceptable Whigs, and Democrats pledged to reform, and obtained a decisive majority in the next Common Council. Chapter 20. Fernando Wood's first administration, 1854 to 1856. Though the City Reform Party brought about some beneficial changes in the system of city government, its Common Council did not meet public expectations. The Tribune, the chief supporter of the party, admitted this on May 8, 1854, declaring that much feeling was manifested over the failure of the reformers to realize the public hopes, and attributing the failure, quote, to the power of those representing the great political parties in the two boards to league together and sell out to each other the interests of the city as partisan or personal considerations might dictate, unquote. Accordingly, preparations were made to overthrow the new party. Fernando Wood now secured the soft-shell nomination for mayor by packing the convention with his henchmen. The hard-shells held a separate convention which ended in a row, a part nominating Wood, and the rest Augustus Schell. Wood successfully intrigued to cause the Whigs to separate from the city reformers, and to further divide the opposition, Tammany nominated sham reformers for the lesser city and state offices. The Whigs nominated for mayor John J. Herrick, the city reformers Wilson G. Hunt, and the Native Americans, or Know-Nothings, springing to life again, put forward James W. Barker. Schell, Wood's Tammany opponent, withdrew in favor of Hunt. The disreputable classes, believing that his success meant increased prosperity to themselves, energetically supported Wood, and the liquor dealers formally commended him. In the city at this time were about 10,000 shiftless, unprincipled persons who lived by their wits and the labor of others. The trade of a part of these was turning primary elections, packing nominating conventions, repeating, and breaking up meetings. Most of these were Wood's active allies. He needed them all on election day. With every resource strained to the utmost, he won by a close margin. He was credited with 19,993 votes. Barker with 18,553, Hunt 15,386, and Herrick 5,712. Tammany, therefore, succeeded, though in a minority of over 17,000 votes. Upon assuming office, Wood surprised his followers by announcing that he would purge all offices of corruption and give good government. His messages were filled with flattering promises and lofty sentiments. At the outset, he seemed disposed for good. He closed the saloons on Sunday, suppressed brothels, gambling houses, and rowdyism, had the streets cleaned, and opened a complaint book. The religious part of the community for a time believed in him. He assumed personal charge of the police, and when a bill was introduced in the legislature to strip him of this power, the foremost citizens called a mass meeting to support him. The troubles between the hard-shells and soft-shells continued throughout the year 1855. When the latter held their county ratification meeting in the Wigwam, and the name of their nominee for street commissioner was announced, the Hardshells, who had come thither with a nominee of their own, raised an uproar, whereupon, quote, the factions of both sides went to work and pummeled each other pretty soundly and highly satisfactorily to the lookers for at least 10 minutes, unquote. The election of 1855 was of little consequence. All eyes were now turned to the coming contest of 1856. Before the end of a year, Wood had begun to reveal his real nature. Many of the decent element that had for a time believed in him began to turn against him. He had also made himself unpopular with certain powerful sachems by not giving them either a share or a large enough share in the spoils. His appointments were made wholly from a circle of personal friends who were more attached to him than to the Tammany organization. Knowing the folly of expecting a renomination from Tammany, as it was then constituted, he set about it by trickery. Ooh, this Fernando Wood guy was good. Inducing Wilson Small, a custom house officer holding a seat in the General Committee, to resign, Wood had himself substituted. Then he personally assumed control of the primary inspectors in every ward, so as to manipulate the election of convention delegates. He caused the appointment of an executive committee, which was to have the entire choice of inspectors in every instance in which the General Committee failed to agree. This new committee was composed mainly of his friends, and he named himself chairman. His henchmen incited divisions in such of the wards as were not under the control of his inspectors, and the contests, upon being referred to the quote-unquote executive committee, were of course decided in Wood's favor. Thus he appropriated a great majority of the delegates to the nominating convention. Quote, "It is well known," unquote, wrote Peter Sweeney and J. Y. Savage, secretaries of the Tammany General Committee, in a long statement denouncing Wood's thimble rigging, quote, "that for many years this primary system has been degenerating, until it has become so corrupt as to be a mere machine in the hands of unprincipled men, by which they foist themselves before the people as the nominees of a party for office, in defiance of public sentiment," unquote. Sweeney and Savage charged further that when the primary elections took place under this patent process for cheating the people, the ballot boxes were stuffed, and detachments of police were stationed at every poll to aid Wood's agents and bully his opponents. A sickening mass of evidence of corruption was at hand, Sweeney and Savage recounted. Wood was renominated by the city convention, and at an hour when most of his opponents on the General Committee were absent, he had that body endorse his nomination by a vote of 56 to 26, nearly all of those voting being office holders by his grace. He also arranged a reconciliation between the hardshells and soft shells. With a show of traditional Tammany custom, the softs marched in Indian file to the Stuyvesant Institute, the headquarters of the Hards, and the reunited leaders marched back to Tammany Hall in pairs, arm in arm. The hard-shell-soft-shell contention thus became a thing of the past. But Wood's personal enemies in the wigwam were not to be appeased, and they nominated a candidate to oppose him, James S. Libby. Bitter feelings were aroused. At the Wood ratification meeting in the wigwam, October 22nd, both Wood and anti-Wood men crowded in. And then ensued another of those clashes for which Tammany Hall had become so celebrated. When John Kelly mentioned Wood's name, the anti-Wood men raised a din and smothered the speaker's voice. The Wood men, growing enraged, quote, pitched into the anti-Woodites hot and heavy, and for a time a scene of the wildest clamor ensued. A general fight took place in front of the speaker's stand and all round the room. Blows were given and exchanged with great spirit, and not a few faces were badly disfigured, unquote. After a few planks had been plucked from the stand and wielded with telling effect, the Wood men won. Quote, the great body of the Libbyites were kicked out of the room and down the stairs with a velocity proportionate to the expelling force behind, unquote. The City Reform Party was far from being satisfied with Wood's administration. In fact, it is no exaggeration to say that by the time of his second year in office, the blackness of his administration exceeded anything known before. Seasoned men fancied they knew something of corruption and extravagance and malfeasance in the City Hall, but by 1856 they better understood the growth of these under a reckless and unprincipled mayor. The saloon power had grown until it controlled the politics of the city. In every groggery could be found a crowd of loafers and bruisers who could always be relied upon to pack a primary or ensure or defeat the election of certain nominees. In these saloons, the ward politicians held their meetings, and the keepers were ready at all times to furnish persons to parade, carrying partisan banners they could not read, or to cheer at mass meetings at the drop of a handkerchief. The saloon keepers also furnished cheap illegal voters, ballot box stuffers, and thoroughbred quote-unquote shoulder hitters to intimidate peaceable citizens, or, as a last resort, to smash the ballot boxes. There's your American history, you voting fools, you voting foolish Americans. You're still voting. Why? Why? Because you're ignorant. The saloon keepers were largely above the law. A disingenuous bill passed in 1855 ordered the saloons to be closed on Sunday, but it made no provision for enforcement. They were accordingly kept open, likely enough through assurances from Wood that the owners would not be molested. Their support of the mayor was well nigh unanimous. It was the domination of politics by this element that caused great irritation and disgust. But the opposition to Wood was hopelessly divided. It had to contend, moreover, with the adverse factor of the introduction into the campaign of national issues. The fear of the new Republican Party was sure to bring out a heavy vote for Buchanan and Breckinridge. And on the strength of this wave, Tammany reasonably expected to be again swept into power. The city reformers had greatly declined in numbers, but they again came forward for the contest, nominating Judge James R. Whiting. The Native American Party still maintaining its bitterness against the control of politics by foreigners, chose Isaac O. Barker, and the Whigs Anthony J. Bleecker, making, with Wood and Libby, 5 mayoralty candidates. Though backed by the dregs of the city on the one hand, Wood did not neglect to secure some quote-unquote respectability on the other. During the campaign, he received a testimonial signed by some of the leading bankers and merchants, praising him and his administration and expressing the hope of his re-election. Nearly all of the signers, it was afterwards disclosed, profited by Wood's placing of city funds or buying of city goods. Wood sought to force every man on the police force to subscribe to his election fund, one policeman who refused to contribute being kept on duty 24 hours at a stretch. From this source alone, he gathered in from $8,500 to $10,000. On election day, the scum of the town shouted, repeated, and bruised for Wood. There's your American history. Candidates were traded openly, and bribing was unconcealed. There's your American history. The majority of the policemen were off on furlough, given by the mayor as head of the police department, assisting actively for his re-election. At the polling places, so terrific was the competition for the millions of city plunder that the Wood and anti-Wood men fought savagely. In the 6th Ward, the Wood partisans, upon being attacked, retreated for the while, and coming back, armed with brickbats, clubs, axes, and pistols, set upon and routed their foes. The police, meanwhile, calmly looked on, until the riot was at its height, when they made a show of concern by firing 15 or more shots, all of which fortunately went astray. The Wood partisans then broke the ballot boxes to pieces and carried off the fragments for kindling wood. There's your American history. There's your prestigious tradition of honest elections in America. What a joke. In the 17th Ward, the anti-Wood men destroyed some of the wood boxes, and in the 1st and most of the other wards, the day was enlivened with assaults, riots, and stabbings. The count of the vote gave Wood 34,860, Barker 25,209, Bleecker 9,654, Libby 4,764, and Whiting 3,646. The Buchanan electors carried the city with 41,913 votes. Fillmore, the American candidate, and Fremont, Republican, were allowed, respectively, 19,924 and 17,771 votes. Tammany Hall obtained a serviceable majority in the Common Council. The Republicans maintained that 10,000 fraudulent Democratic votes were cast in New York City and Brooklyn, and credited Wood with having profited by the most of those cast in this city. it was not an unreasonable contention, in view of the enormous increase over the vote of 2 years before. A few days after the election, a meeting in Tammany Hall, called to celebrate Buchanan's triumph, resolved that next to the success of Buchanan and Breckinridge, quote, the brightest and most signal achievement of the Democratic Party at this election was the triumphant election of Fernando Wood, unquote. All right, folks, this has been chapters 19 and 20 from The History of Tammany Hall by Gustavus Myers. You've been listening to Reject